In the last statements video, we went over the witness reports of the Range Rover seen on the 6th of December 95 with a mysterious white Cosworth. But there were also several witnesses that saw just the Range Rover or a similar looking one to the one that Pat, Tony and Craig had been seen in the weeks before the murders. One report of a Range Rover entering Workhouse Lane at around about 10 to 7 on the 6th of December. Roughly around the same time, Darren Nichols said that the Range Rover containing Pat, Tony, Craig and Michael Steele was entering the lane too. But the witness gave a different description to the blue Vogue Range Rover and also the people inside. The first sighting of the Range Rover, if it was the same one, was at the entrance to Workhouse Lane on the Wednesday morning, 24 hours before discovery of the three deceased. Now, the first witness statement that saw a Range Rover was in the area of Workhouse Lane, but this was 10 days before the murders of Pat, Tony and Craig. On Monday the 27th of November, the witness saw a Range Rover going down the dirt track, not long before 9 in the morning. The following statement is from Paul Draper from the 18th of the 12th 95. I live in Great Bedell, Essex and work at Runwell Hospital as a thermal installation engineer. Although I work from Runwell Hospital, this is only where my office is and I work all over Essex. At least twice a week or sometimes more regular, I go to my office in Runwell. When going there from home, I always travel in my own vehicle or my wife's and use the A130 road which takes me through Residon and then towards Runwell. My vehicle is a red Sierra Estate and my wife's is a red Ford Fiesta. On Monday the 27th of the 11th 95, I again went to work via my office in Runwell. On that day, I recall leaving home to go to work about 8:30 a.m. On that occasion, I drove my wife's Ford Fiesta. I took the same route I always take to get to work, and that is through Great Bedell into Morham's Lane and down the Slip Road, onto Southend Road and finally straight across the roundabout under the A12, then onto the A130 heading towards Residon. Whilst travelling along the A130, my attention was drawn to a vehicle travelling in front of me. This vehicle was a dark metallic blue Range Rover. My attention was drawn to this vehicle as it started to indicate to turn left off the A130 when I was travelling behind it. The Range Rover, like myself, was travelling towards Residon and its indicators came on just after it passed Whitehouse Farm, which was on the left. At first I thought the vehicle was going to turn off the road further along. However, I saw the brake lights come on earlier and then it turned on a dirt track on the left. I have knowledge of this dirt track as I know the farmer Mr. Fearbold and I know there is a lake at the end of the track where fishermen go. Due to this, I thought the people in the vehicle were going fishing. I never thought anything more of the sighting until a week later when there was news about an incident down the track involving a Range Rover and I therefore contacted the police. I would best describe the Range Rover I saw as a newish style, although I cannot recall the number plate. The vehicle had flash-looking wheels, in that they had 3-spoked wheel trims, which was the same colour as the vehicle. When the vehicle turned left, I could see there was something in the boot, although I cannot recall what. However, having thought about that day, I did not see any rod holders, as the back seats were up, and if they were fishermen with rods, they would have probably been sticking up. The vehicle had a driver and one front passenger. I would describe the driver as a white male of stocky build with probably longer hair than the front passenger. I would describe the front passenger as a white male of stocky build with short dark hair. Both front seats I recall had headrests. Although I was behind the vehicle when it turned off the A130, I cannot remember when I got behind it. I do know the Range Rover did not turn into my path, and I believe I may well have caught up with it as I travelled along the A130. When the Range Rover turned left into the track, the time would have been about 8:40 to 8:50 a.m, as it only takes me 10 minutes or so to get to that area when I travel from home, and I usually arrive at Runwell about 8:50 to 9 a.m. I am certain of the date being Monday the 27th 11th 95, as I can recall that week going into my office twice, and the first time was Monday morning. After the Range Rover had turned left and entered the track, I passed it and looked down briefly when I saw the vehicle slowly travelling along the track. I have not seen the vehicle since that date. Now, unfortunately, the witness did not see any registration of the Range Rover as it went down the dirt track, and he did not see any fishing rods, so he assumed they were not there for the fishing pond. So if this was the Range Rover that the bodies of Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe were discovered in just over a week later, then what was their purpose of going down the lane a week before? We're meant to believe they were being shown it by Michael Steele, according to the lies of Darren Nichols. So if this was the Range Rover containing Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that they knew that area and they knew that field. And were they possibly going down that dirt track to enter the field beyond the gate? And if they were, what was their purpose? Now, the next witness statement that saw a Range Rover in the area of Workhouse Lane was on the day of the murders, if you believe they were murdered before midnight. If you believe in the Billy Jasper theory, then of course the murders took place on the 7th of December. But on the 6th of December 95, the witness saw a Range Rover at the entrance of the dirt track with 3 people talking outside. If this was the 7th of December, it might be easy to assume this was Peter Theobald and Ken Jiggins waiting for the police to turn up at the lane after being called after the discovery of the Range Rover with the 3 deceased. But this was the day before, and 3 people talking outside of the Range Rover. Could this have been Craig, Tony and Pat? Or could this have been a different Range Rover with absolutely nothing to do with the murders? The following is the statement from Francis Darling from the 11th of the 12th, 95. I am retired, but as a part-time job, I am employed by the Essex County Council as an escort for disabled people. This is a daily job, and we travel from Chelmsford to Basildon via the A130. I leave Chelmsford usually about 7:20am, 7:30am, and we normally arrive in Basildon around about 8:45. Sometime between 7:55 and 8:05 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December 95, the coach I was travelling on was on the A130 Rettendon. As the road goes through the dual carriageway into a single carriageway, the road bears sharply to the left. On the left-hand side of the road is situated a farm shop, and past this is a farm track. As we approached the farm track, I could see a dark-coloured Range Rover motor vehicle, which was either black or blue, parked in the entrance to the farm track and facing into it. Standing next to the Range Rover and on the south end side of the vehicle was 3 men. I can only describe these men as all wearing dark clothing, and the one that was standing nearest to the Range Rover was taller than the other 2 and was wearing a hat. The man nearest the Range Rover appeared to be taller. It appeared as if though the vehicle may have broken down and they were waiting for someone, and had been broken down there for some time. I do not believe I'd recognise any of these men again. I only saw these men for about 2 to 3 seconds as the coach passed them, and I had a clear and obstructed view of these men. Where the statement says Range Rover, the vehicle could have been a Land Rover. And then just an hour and a half later, around about 9:30am, a witness saw a Range Rover parked on the right side of the road in a track which he believed led to fields and a farm. The following statement is from Sha Morgan from the 22nd of the 2nd, 96. I am an area manager for the Co-op Chemist, and as part of my role, I travel around all of South Essex. On the 7th of the 12th, 95, as a result of media coverage about the murders of a group of men in a Range Rover at Rettendon, Essex, I contacted the police regarding a vehicle I had seen on the 6th of the 12th, 95. I know it was the 6th as it was the day before the news reports of the murders. I recall that about 9:30 hours that morning, I was travelling from Tiptree towards the A112, Colchester bound, in my car, a blue-green Vauxhall Cavalier, along a road which passes Riverhall End and joins the A112. Whilst travelling along this road, I crossed a small bridge before meeting the A12 junction. I recall at this time there's quite a bit of traffic due to the restricted passing on the bridge, and I was travelling slowly. I remember seeing a blue Range Rover parked on the right side of the road in a track which I believe leads to farms and a field. The track was situated near a bend in the road after you crossed the bridge heading towards the A112. As I passed the vehicle, I was aware there was a lot of people in it. I could see 2 men in front and also a man in the back, but I cannot describe them any further than that. I recall the driver of the Range Rover was wearing a light coloured top. It was this male I remember was looking at my general direction, and it looked like he was following me with his eyes as I drove past them. Because of this, I looked away. I can only add that these men were not old men, but middle-aged. I then drove past them around the bend towards the A112. I never saw them again. At the time I passed in the vehicle, I was about 20 feet away and the weather was fine and clear. I wish to add that I've seen footage of the Range Rover involved in the murders being taken away from the scene by the police. It was seeing this Range Rover and that it was similar to the one I'd seen on the 6th that prompted me to call the police. I am unable to give any further details of the vehicle or the people inside it, other than the vehicle was facing towards the road and was parked up and not waiting to pull out as there was plenty of gaps. It was my belief that they were waiting for someone or something. I know that it was about 9:30 a.m. or thereabouts as I left home in Tolleson Major about 9:15 a.m. and it was about 15 minutes to get to that location. Now, if this was the Range Rover that the 3 deceased were found in the following day, the big question remains is why they were down Workhouse Lane at 9:30 in the morning the day before. What was their real reasons of being down that field? And is there any slight element of truth to Darren Nichols' version of a plane dropping drugs into said field beyond the gate? Were they there looking for packages that had already been dropped the night before, or were they waiting for a plane to drop? At that time of the morning, with so many witnesses, either way is a big risk. Now, as mentioned in the last video with the Range Rover sightings, with the Cosworth sightings, there were various reports of the Range Rover and the white vehicle at White House Farm during that day. Now, later on Wednesday the 6th of December, around about 5:15, not far from the A130, a witness stated describing the Range Rover with 2 people in the back and a description that sounded like Craig Rolfe was driving. The following statement is from Arthur White from the 27th of the 12th 95. Around 17:15 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December 95, I was travelling along the A127 Arterial Road in the general direction of Southend. At this time, I had just left Basildon. It was damp and dark. I was driving my own car, which is a metallic blue Austin Metro, in the offside lane. I was alone. Somewhere near the turn-off for the A130, I was aware of a blue-coloured Range Rover travelling in the near side lane of the dual carriageway, just ahead of me in the same direction. There was a couple of cars in front of me, then the Range Rover in front of them. The road was busy with cars at this time. My attention was drawn to the Range Rover because the driver seemed to be unsure of where he was going. I say this because on 2 occasions he moved towards the offside lane and he went back to the near side lane immediately. These manoeuvres were deliberate in as much that in hindsight he must have been trying to obtain a view of the traffic ahead. The Range Rover was a mid-blue colour and seemed in good condition. There were 2 people in the back, which were both white men. I would age them at around about 30 to 40 years of age. I think that they were scruffy and were not suited to that type of car. I saw the driver momentarily on the 2 occasions that he pulled over. He was a white man, slightly younger than the 2 in the back. I couldn't see if the front passenger seat was occupied or not. I would describe the driver as having straight, dark, shortish hair. He was clean shaven. I seem to recall that the man behind the driver had a dark reefer type coat. The jacket had big lapels on it. I cannot describe the men any further. When I saw them, I was driving at a speed between 40 to 45 miles per hour. I last saw the Range Rover when it turned off onto the A130, as if they were going to Chelmsford or Canvey Island. Since the 6th of December 95, I have been aware through local media of the 3 men shot dead at Retterdon. I have seen pictures of these 3 on the news. I can only say that the persons I saw were similar to these 3. Now, the way this witness describes the driving of the Range Rover, stating that the driver seemed to be unsure of where he was going. He said this because on 2 occasions he moved towards the offside lane and then went back to the near side lane immediately. Was this Craig Rolfe looking for the white Cosworth vehicle, possibly ahead of them, or the Range Rover trying to keep up with the white Cosworth? Or were they looking for an entrance to another field? Now, this is just 13 minutes before Rebecca Carr saw the Range Rover on the Rettendon Turnpike, possibly heading back towards the track, which was also the same time that Donna Jaggers stated that Craig Rolfe was dropping her off at the Lakeside Shopping Centre. Now, just 45 minutes later, between 5 to 6 and 6 o'clock, the next witness saw a Range Rover, again, entering the dirt track just beyond Whitehouse Farm. But the witness stated that this Range Rover was possibly dark green and not the one containing Pat, Tony and Craig. The following statement is from Richard Manzel from the 24th of the 1st 96. I work at the Ministry of Defence Police Headquarters at Wethersfield, Essex. Most days I travel to and from along the A130 towards the Rettendon Turnpike and the A12. On a day in early December 95, which date I cannot remember precisely, I was driving from work along the A130. I passed a farm on the near side and then climbed the curving rise towards Rettendon village. I saw facing me on the opposite side of the road a dark coloured Range Rover indicating to cross the road and positioned at a slight angle as a confident driver might do who knew a turning well. I stopped to allow the vehicle to pass across in front of me and down a track to the left. I now know this to be Workhouse Lane. The driver raised his hand in thanks, and I recall that he was wearing something white, probably a shirt. I cannot recall if there was anyone else in the front passenger seat. As the vehicle passed in front of me, I recall there was a passenger in the rear near side of the vehicle. I believe the colour of the vehicle was possibly dark green. I had not noticed this lane before, therefore the event was unusual, and this is why I remembered it. I logged my times of departure and arrival from and to work, and from and to home, and on the 6th of December 95, I arrived home at 18:12. It takes about 15 minutes to 17 minutes depending on traffic to travel from Workhouse Lane to my home, so I'd have been at the lane between 17:55 and 1800 hours. It was several days after the murder of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe when I saw a police notice by the roadside. That is when I realised where Workhouse Lane was. It was some time later that I heard on the television that the police wished to hear from the driver who had stopped to let the Range Rover cross, and I contacted the incident room shortly afterwards. This would be just an hour before the official murder time, according to Darren Nichols, which was just before 7 p.m. But with this Range Rover being a different colour, whose could this have been? We know that John Marshall did own a Range Rover, and that Tony Tucker also owned a green Range Rover. Could this have been the farmers Ken Jiggins and Peter Fearbold in their Land Rover? But that was stated that they normally fed their pheasants and ducks a lot at an earlier time, around about 4 p.m. And the following statement would put the Range Rover and this Range Rover again in two places at the same time. The following statement is from Andrew Reynolds from the 2nd of the 1st 96. I currently work as a mechanic at Basildon Tyre Services, Cranes Close, Basildon, where I've worked for the last year. There are 4 other people who work at the garage. They're Colin Russell, the new manager Steve Thomas, who is like the assistant manager, and 2 tyre fitters, Alan Crew and Rob, who I cannot remember his surname. Part of our work involves carrying out repair work on motor vehicles. Since my school days, I've known Craig Rolfe on a friendship basis only, but not on a social level. After I started working at the garage, I became aware of Craig Rolfe's friends who he socialised with. These were Tony Tucker and Pat Tate. I knew Tony before, but only as a person who used to work on the doors at nightclubs. Pat Tate, I met only a few months ago when he came in with Craig and Tony to the garage when I was working. From early November 95, Craig started to bring vehicles into the garage to be fixed. The first vehicle was a Peugeot, which over a period of a week or so, Craig bought in twice. First for the brakes, and secondly for the engine which had blown. As a result, Craig borrowed a blue J registered Vauxhall Vitara from the garage. Due to having the vehicle in, Craig always used to ring the garage to check up on it. Around about the 29th to the 30th of November 95, Tony and Craig bought in a private plated Vitara motor vehicle, coloured metallical blue and grey for new tyres. I'd been awaiting this vehicle as Craig had been ringing us to ask when the tyres were going to be ready. As far as I'm aware, the Vitara belonged to Tony's girlfriend. They took the vehicle the same day, having waited for the tyres to be fitted. However, on the following Monday, the 4th of the 12th 95, the Vitara was brought back to us as it had lost reverse. The following day, the 5th of the 12th 95, Tony called the garage and asked to pick up the Vitara, however the vehicle needed longer for repair, so it was kept until the 6th of November. On the 6th of November 95, I was again working at the garage when about 10 a.m. to 11 a.m, Pat Tate arrived at the garage with a girl I know only as Pat's girlfriend Liz. They arrived by car, Pat in his black E or F registered Mercedes and Liz in a Polo motor vehicle black in colour on an E or F plate. The Polo was left at the garage for repair, and then Pat phoned somebody who he called Tony, and I took this to be Tony Tucker. He asked him about the Vitara, and the arrangements were made that Pat would take the Vitara away and Liz drove the Mercedes. Sometime that afternoon, Steve told me that Pat had telephoned and was talking with Steve. I understood that Pat was desperate to get the Polo back for his girlfriend. Later that day, I received a call at the garage from Pat, who asked about collecting the Polo, and the arrangements were made that if Pat had not turned up by 6 p.m, when we were due to close, that I would leave the Polo on the forecourt with the keys in the glove box. At 6 p.m, on the 6th of the 12th, 95, the garage closed, and I left the Polo on the forecourt with the keys in, as arranged for Pat. As I drove away from the garage, in my white Astra van, Steve was behind me in his E-registered grey BMW, and in front of me was Alan in his blue Orion. I drove onto Cranes Close and along Cranes Farm Road towards the roundabout junction with East Main Basildon. As I got to the roundabout, the time would have been about 18:05. I saw a blue Range Rover, which I recognised as the one Craig, Tony and Pat use. I knew it was them and their Range Rover, as I'd seen them with it on several occasions before. I could clearly see Craig was driving. Tony was in the front passenger seat, and there was a stocky male between the seats at the back, and I took this to be Pat Tate, as this was the usual way when they sat when I'd seen him in the past. They were travelling on the other side of Cranes Farm Road, in the opposite direction to me, heading towards the garage, and I thought they were going to collect the Polo. I recalled the registration of the Range Rover as an F plate. At about 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. that evening, I had cause to drive down Cranes Farm Close and past the garage. I looked and saw the Polo had gone, and I took it that Pat Tate had collected it. I never saw Craig, Tony and Pat again. Sometime in the afternoon of Thursday the 7th of the 12th 95, I was working at the garage when I heard that 3 men had been found dead in a Range Rover. This started a result of calls being made to the garage about the report of a Range Rover being found with 3 dead people inside. Believing it was Craig, Pat and Tony, I telephoned Pat's girlfriend Liz about 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. that same afternoon. I telephoned one of Pat's mobile phone numbers, which was answered by a female, who I took to be Liz. I asked her about the killings, and she said she didn't know anything. On Tuesday the 2nd of the 1st 96, police attended my home and asked me about telephone calls recorded as having been made to the garage. I can only state that these calls would have been in relation to the vehicles Craig, Pat and Tony had either left with us or been making arrangements to drop them off. I only saw the 3 in the vehicle at 18:05 on the 6th of the 12th 95, and I did not look to see if there was anybody else. I cannot recall what they were wearing. So Andrew Reynolds stating he definitely saw Craig Rolfe driving the Range Rover with Tony Tucker in the front passenger seat and a stocky male between the seats at the back which was clearly Pat Tate. Now this would have been the same time as the witness before saw the green Range Rover entering Workhouse Lane, so clearly couldn't have been in two places at once. But this was just 15 minutes after Donna Jaggers said that Craig Rolfe had dropped her off at the Lakeside Shopping Centre. Now the final statement from Raymond Wright saw a Range Rover entering Workhouse Lane at 10 to 7. Now if this was the Range Rover containing Pat Tate, Tony Tucker, Craig Rolfe and Michael Steele, then we'll be led to believe that possibly really they were murdered before 7 o'clock. But the witness describes this Range Rover as being different to the one containing Pat, Tony, Craig and possibly Michael Steele or some other fourth passenger that we don't know the identity of. The following is the statement of Raymond Wright from the 30th of the 12th 95. I am the owner of a Ford Escort motor vehicle, colour red. On Wednesday the 6th of December 95, my wife and myself attended a funeral, and as such we left our young son at my mother's house in Pitsea. The funeral we attended was in Reigate, and I had to drop my wife and mother-in-law off in Hornchurch. After this, I carried on to Pitsea, where I picked up my son. The route that I would travel from Pitsea to Tolly Darcy includes the A130 from the Soldiers Farm roundabout to the East Hanningfield turn-off. I do not know exactly what time it was that I picked my son up, but I'm aware that I arrived home in Tolly Darcy around 7:20 to 7:25pm that evening. As I was travelling along the A130, I went through the Rettendon Turnpike in the direction of Chelmsford. When you come through the Rettendon village into a restricted road area, the road then goes into a series of bends on a decline on the road. Because I'm a regular user of the road, I'm aware that on these bends there is situated a farm shop and a gun club on the right hand side of the road, and I'm aware there could be vehicles waiting to turn right. As I entered this decline, I became aware that the vehicles in front of me had slowed down. This would have been about 250 feet earlier than I would have anticipated stopping. I slowly caught up with the vehicles in front, but I had to brake quite heavily in the end because I had anticipated that any vehicle would be turning into the farm. I then stopped in the line of traffic, and I believed I was either 2 or 3 cars from the front of the line. I believe I was stationary for approximately 10 seconds when an oncoming vehicle left a gap for the vehicle that was turning right to cut across the traffic. As I did, I could see the vehicle was a 4x4 vehicle, and because of the shape of the rear of the vehicle and a grille over the rear lights, my immediate reaction was that it was a Range Rover. I believe that the vehicle was dark in colour. I think it was possibly green. I don't know why, but I think there was at least 3 people in the vehicle, but I think there may have been 4. I was aware that there was a driver of the vehicle who was in the dark and a person who was sitting in the rear of the vehicle behind the driver's seat. This person, who I believe to be a man because of his size, appeared to be bigger than the driver. He was wearing a light fawn coloured upper garment. As the vehicle started to turn, I got the impression that the person in the back looked over his shoulder in the direction of the Rettendon Turnpike. The vehicle then went onto the farm track that I did not know existed. I then continued my journey along the A130, and because I wasn't aware of the farm track, I looked down the track and I could see the rear of the vehicle that had turned into the track, but I do not remember seeing the reflectors of any vehicles in front of it. I then continued my journey home. I believe the time the incident occurred would have been between 6:50pm and 7pm, because it normally takes me about 30 minutes to travel home from there. I don't believe I was more than 2 cars behind the Range Rover, so when it turned, I would have been no more than 30 feet from the vehicle. I had a clear and obstructed view of the vehicle for a period of approximately 2 seconds while it crossed in front of me. Although that area of the road is not lit, there was some lighting from vehicles coming from the opposite direction. At the time I saw this, the traffic was quite heavy, especially traffic travelling towards Southend. I do wear glasses, but this is not necessarily when driving. The man in the fawn-coloured garment in the rear of the vehicle appeared to be sat tight against the window and was even leaning with his right shoulder against the window. Now within the evidence shown in the courts of the trial of Michael Steele and Jack Worms was a photo of Darren Nichols and Michael Steele, possibly taken in Amsterdam. Darren Nichols is wearing a fawn-coloured top, the same colour that Raymond Wright describes as the backseat passenger as wearing in the Range Rover entering the dirt track. But this Range Rover was described as being green and having grills over the rear lights, which is clearly different to the Range Rover being driven by Craig with Tony and Pat, and of course what we're meant to believe Michael Steele as the fourth passenger. So how involved in the murders was Darren Nichols? Was he more than just the apparent getaway driver to apparently Michael Steele and Jack Williams in his version, or was he the getaway driver to possibly two other people or another shooter, or not involved at all? Now, with all the sightings of a Range Rover seen going down the dirt track in the weeks and the day leading up to the murders of the three deceased, could it be possible, with all the sightings at the lane, that someone found out about the plans or what they were up to going down there throughout that day, and possibly what was beyond that locked gate, if that was their actual intentions of being down there? Could it be the pond? Could it have been something that was already dropped in that field, and that's why they kept returning to try to get to the field and try to find what had been dropped? Or was something being dropped that evening? Also remembering the statement from Kevin Tarbuck from 1940 on the evening of 6th of December, we saw a white van driving from the dirt track, nearly driving into incoming traffic. Was this sighting of the white van a connection to the three deceased? Was it Darren Nichols, or, as many believe, possibly the police and the surveillance that was apparently watching Pat, Tony and Craig until the day before the murders? And also the following morning, and the sighting of the white Ford Cosworth at the entrance of the lane just an hour before the discovery by Ken and Peter Fearbold. With no time of death taken, the mystery will always be what time were the three actually murdered. Before 7, according to the testimony of self-confessed liar Darren Nichols, after 7, 9, as many believe, or after midnight, according to the Billy Jasper theory, as many now tend to believe, because of the new information recently released to do with the Billy Jasper theory and the possible real motive for the murders of the three.